SaaS Therapy.
Everyone, and welcome to another edition of SaaS Therapy, the show where we help you save your most important business relationships, your customers. I'm your host, Todd Kirk. I'm joined by my co-host, Casey Trujillo, and we have an amazing guest on who I'm really pumped to talk to, mostly just because in the pre-show, we were talking to Amy about her experience and her background. And whenever I hear someone talk about their expertise and I know it's going to be really good, I just get really excited. So we are pleased to introduce Amy Konary, who's the co-founder of the Subscribed Institute and an amazing thought leader who I'm really pumped to interview. Amy, welcome to SaaS Therapy.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here. I'm excited.
Well, Amy, I'm going to tell you right now, Todd is so excited that he skips the part where he gives me some title as he introduces me as his co-host. I'm deeply offended
It's
by
usually
that.
something. It's usually something like degrading. I try to make fun of him.
Yeah,
and
what the heck?
I'm sorry.
The audience came used to this, Todd. Okay, let's get started. Amy, give us the background. Why are you so famous? Why are you so cool? Let's brag a little bit about yourself. I know that's not what you want to do, but hey, give us a little bit of a background of your experience. What is your areas of strength so we can dive into this topic that Todd and I are so excited to talk to you about.
Awesome. All right. So first of all, I would say I have teenagers, so I am so not cool, and I know that. Not used to being called cool or famous. But I will say, why am I on this podcast, and why do I love talking about the things I've been talking about? I've had, I think, a very interesting career in, I'll call it the software industry. I started off in software because I loved coding as a kid. I had a Commodore 64 in my room. I had to fight my dad for time on it because he wanted to play games and I wanted to write code. But I joined the software industry out of college, and I very quickly became disillusioned. It was a perpetual license software company. We used to, as every company did back then, we would deliver our product on CDs. They'd be shipped out to the customer in this giant box. In fact, it was nicknamed the coffin because that's literally like the size of this box with all the CDs. We'd send it to the customers. We'd recognize all that revenue up front. And the goal, right, was there was no marginal additional cost other than printing the CDs of acquiring a new customer other than your own internal sales costs. But we would try to extract as much value up front. And then we'd ship this coffin to the customer, and it was up to the customer to figure out how to get value out of it. And at that time, there were very famously companies that were going bankrupt trying to install software. They were epic failures, capital costs that had to be written off, big systems integration costs that were sometimes 3 to 4x the cost of the actual license, and they never got implemented. And then after that, the customer was contractually obligated to pay a maintenance fee to the vendor in perpetuity. And it felt like there was a much better way. So I became an industry analyst at that time, fairly early in my career, really because I wanted to get a lay of the land. And I always had customers in mind and thought, gosh, there's got to be a better way for customers to see value from software. And as the new analyst at that time, there was this category of software called ASPs. My boss at the time had actually coined that phrase, application service provisioners, they were called. And they would take the physical media of the software, they'd install it in their data centers, and they would basically provision access to that software over the network, over the internet. This was somewhat early days of thinking that you'd get access to your business software online. It was quite revolutionary. You still license the software you always had, but someone else was taking on the risk of running it for you. And that felt like a really good model because the risk of installing the software on your servers, keeping your data center secure, and keeping the software patched and updated, that was a tall task for a lot of companies at that time. So this ASP model was much better, but it was just an incremental step. So the next thing that happened, obviously, that we probably all know is there were people that were thinking, well, what if instead of licensing the software and taking that core, enterprise client server software and running it on these enterprise data centers, and like, what if we actually developed the software from the very beginning, thinking that people were going to be accessing this over a network, that value was going to be created over time, because that is frankly how you get value out of a service. And instead of selling ones and zeros, we're actually selling a service. That was the original idea of software as a service. It didn't have a name. It wasn't a market. These companies, if you want to call them that, were in strip malls and in people's apartments. But as the new analyst, I was given the task of like, go figure out what this is, go talk to these people, find out how much money they're doing, and produce a market size and forecast, because we think that this thing is important. And at that time, the whole software industry was upfront perpetual revenue. So if you put them on the same market size, put a net ledger, as NetSuite was called at the time, next to SAP, could be completely apples to oranges, because the way that SAP recognized most of their revenue, which was upfront in these perpetual license contracts, completely different from how NetSuite might be getting their revenue. And of course, it's recognized over time. Well, anyway, I had to create the market. I had to name it. I named it software as a service because there was a services analyst that wanted to cover it too. She actually wanted to call it services as software. But my argument was really what the customers are buying is access to the functionality for a business outcome. It's not a managed service. At that time, the services industry was very focused on managed, business process outsourcing, where you're outsourcing the entire process. I said, this is very different. You're really just outsourcing, or outsourcing isn't even the right word. You're accessing this functionality over the internet. So it became software as a service. I covered that as an industry analyst for many years, which meant that I became a de facto expert on all of the business changes that you need to make in order to become a successful SaaS company. Like, customer success didn't exist. So I was advising companies on how you build a customer success function. Sales compensation models had to change. So I was advising companies on that. Pricing and packaging, completely different for SaaS. And you have these land and expand motions, which are very different from the upfront, maybe more extractive perpetual license models. And so I was advising pretty much any company that became a SaaS company, either transitioned into SaaS or built a SaaS business, was likely my customer, until I got really itchy to get back into an operator seat. And that's when I joined Zuora. And that's where I have been for the last 8 years or so of my career. I launched and founded the Institute, which we can talk about. I've had executive roles in customer success and sales and strategy and in marketing. And all along, I continue to advise companies, many of them Zuora's customers, on this ever evolving landscape that we call the software industry.
Oh my goodness. Amy, for all the intros we've ever heard, I've never heard one that feels like the origin story of a superhero, which is really cool. So honestly, our show is called SaaS Therapy. So hearing that backstory is amazing. And what I love is, I think so many people who are in the SaaS world today don't really understand that at some point, this isn't how business was done when it comes to software, and that has changed, and it will continue to change, and it has evolved over decades. Have you ever seen the movie The Founder? This is really dorky, but it's the story of Ray Kroc and McDonald's, which I know Casey's going to be really happy about because he's obsessed with McDonald's. But one of the things that is really cool about that story and the way the movie portrays Ray Kroc is that the genius of Ray wasn't the fact that he saw the value of the burger. It's that he saw the value of the process and the real estate associated with McDonald's. And so it's kind of a similar story of what you described here, is like, what if we shifted what we're charging for from the software to the service, and now all of a sudden we've shifted, just like Ray Kroc changed from selling the burger to the real estate. And so really, really, really cool. So I'm really pumped for this conversation. I just don't really know where we should start, because there's so many different roads that we should go down or could go down. So I'm curious to hear from Casey. Where do you think we start with Amy? Because clearly there's a deep book that we can dig into.
Yes. Well, because I'm in sales, I want to start with the money. So Amy, what I want to go through is, I would imagine, like you described so very well, that a customer was used to paying these prices, and then the maintenance fee that was every year. And I'm sure people complain, but when you move to the cloud and you move to SaaS and all those things, well, the pricing model shifted, and then people started freaking out, and all of a sudden they love this pricing model that they hated. Do you see any similarities between that transition from on-prem pricing to SaaS pricing to now AI pricing, and how people are trying to approach that? Because AI pricing is trying to take some things from the SaaS world, but then trying to do some different things with it. You're an expert on this. I just saw a post that you just made about it. So walk me through the similarities and the differences, and give us that analyst view of what we should be thinking about.
Yeah, I could go on and on about this topic
Yes.
too. But yeah, I mean, so one thing I'll say, kind of going back to the early days, and not everyone may realize this, but back in the day, SaaS did not replace that perpetual license plus maintenance spend for many years. What happened first, and I'll use Salesforce as an example. We all know Salesforce. In the very early days, Salesforce's strategy was not to talk to IT and not to try to appeal to IT in any way. Salesforce's strategy, they had a Salesforce automation module. It was $5.99 per salesperson per month. And they went directly to those salespeople who bought the service using their corporate Amex and then accessed it using their laptop or their mobile phone down the road. And it wasn't until there was a critical mass of salespeople who were using this tool that IT started to pay attention to it and say, wait a minute, we're paying for this module over here that says it can do the same thing. You need to switch over to the same thing. And the business people, because they already had this entrenched practice of using this tool that was designed for them, said, no way. It was revolt. We are absolutely not going to. And so it took some time, but eventually IT took control of that. But in the very beginning, the adoption strategy was very much not just for Salesforce automation, but for any end user type application. Let's build something for the end user who's trying to solve a business problem, not for the centralized IT organization who's generally looking for positive procurement terms and something that looks good in a PowerPoint presentation. They can go back and say they're representing the needs of the business. Now, I'm not saying this from an anti-IT perspective. I'm just saying this was the messaging that we saw. And I'm seeing a similar type of adoption strategy, of course, with AI. We probably all have personal experience using tools, but you really don't get the ability to kind of supercharge that benefit until you're able to use them in a business context. And IT absolutely has to be involved for all of the reasons we would expect that IT needs to be involved, right? From a security perspective, a compliance perspective, the type of data that you're pulling into these systems. Like, I use a lot of these tools, and I absolutely have recognition of why you'd need to have central management and oversight over these tools. Now, outside of the adoption methodology, let's talk about the pricing model for SaaS and what we're seeing evolve with AI. The pricing model for SaaS was never defined, and I can say this categorically because I created the definition. Per seat pricing was never part of a definition of SaaS. Somehow through the years, that has become equated with that, in part. Like, let's go back again to the fact that these were built for business users. And the easiest way to create a pricing model that's going to get adoption of business users is to charge based on the number of business users that are accessing the environment. Now, you can call that a platform fee. You can do like that. That has been a fundamental part of business applications for a very long time. And frankly, it makes sense and people can understand it. That doesn't mean, though, that usage and even outcome-based pricing, which is what everyone's talking about now with AI, hasn't existed for decades, because it has. Back when I first became an industry analyst, and this was before even 2000, there were companies that were doing outcome and performance-based pricing. That type of pricing model has been around for years, but it tended to be very custom negotiated, in part because the tools for tracking the outcomes and then presenting the outcomes back to the customer in a reliable way, they just really weren't available, in part because software wasn't being provided over a network the way that it is today. You didn't have the analytics. So it was more negotiated. You'd have to have conversation. There's pricing based on revenue. Here's what we think the number is. And the customer would say, well, no, we think we impacted that. The software impacted this. It's like very negotiated model. But it brings up the point that, usage and outcome-based models, these are mature concepts, and they absolutely can and should be a part of the AI conversation today. However, most finance organizations that I talk to through the work that I do in the Institute, which is very much advising companies, not only of pricing and packaging and business models for recurring services, but also talking to a lot of finance teams that are trying to figure out how do I bring these things into my environment. Predictability and costs is really important. And we start to think about things like usage and outcomes, those get less predictable. So what I'm seeing in the pricing and packaging world and with monetization of AI is a yes and as opposed to an either or. So yes and as opposed to an either or conversation where we need to have some measure of predictability. And maybe that's the per seat model that you're familiar with. But we also recognize that there's innovation happening at a pace that we have not seen before in this space. We want customers to be able to access that. Many companies are just making that part of their base price. The first assumption was we'll just increase the overall cost of our thing because we're innovating more quickly. But what we're finding is customers aren't seeing value as rapidly as you're innovating, especially if you're selling to large publicly traded companies. Many of them are putting policies in place. It's kind of, pumping the brakes on AI adoption. For all of the things I said early on, they're worried about security. They're worried about, is what I'm doing going to train a model that then my competitors are going to benefit from? Am I accessing copyrighted information? Do I understand this? Like, there's all kinds of questions that customers have around trust, which means you're not going to be able to necessarily, 6x innovation doesn't mean 6x increase in pricing. And so that's where looking at things like usage pricing or outcomes pricing could be a more fair way of sharing value with customers in some of these innovations, especially given that not every customer is going to adopt AI and AI features and see value at the same rate as others, either because of internal policies, either because they, the benefits or the way that you're building AI into your tools isn't something that they expect to see value of in the same way that someone else will. So that messy hybrid space is where we are right now. And I would expect that to persist because predictability is always something that people are looking for in their business software, for especially in a time of flux like the one we have right now.
Yeah, it's interesting because I've heard a lot of, I like loving this, Amy, because I've heard a lot of SaaS companies who have a pricing model that is fixed around a per seat price, right? And then they know that their customer might want them to introduce some new AI capability, but that now that is incurring a bunch of cost on the side of the SaaS vendor. And so then they're afraid that if they stick with this kind of fixed per seat price, that they're going to actually end up upside down in their cost model. But then they don't know how to shift that to the customer. And if they shift all the way over and then the customer doesn't even use that thing that they're afraid of having a bunch of cost around, now the customer is going to feel like they're afraid. So it's like, where does the burden live if we're trying to do something that's more variable associated with a consumption-based model? And how are people reconciling that in this kind of new world of like, we know there has to be a change in how we tackle it, but like, who takes on the burden and the risk? Is it me as the person selling the software or the customer?
You put ads into AI.
Yes,
and then if you don't want the ads, you pay to get it out. That's where we're going to do it.
Yeah, I mean, I go back to, in my mind a lot, back to two things. One is back to basics of relationships. When I, first started looking at the space of software, and one of the reasons I was so excited about it, and one of the reasons why I told you my origin story, starting with the way that software used to be, is what SaaS did was create a risk shared model where the risk and the burden of seeing value used to be wholly on the customer. Suddenly with this, let's call it the subscription model, with SaaS or recurring revenues or however you want to call it, that created a scenario where if the customer wasn't seeing value, they could stop paying for the software. They could go somewhere else. They hadn't assumed that they were going to get all the value up front. And there was this onus on the vendor because the economics were going to work out for the vendor unless they actually held on to that customer and expanded them. when I used to do a lot of, conversations with companies who are switching from perpetual to subscription, their main question was always, how many years will it take me to recoup my, what I would have gotten in a perpetual license from a subscription customer? And with every single type of software in every scenario, it was always between 3 to 4 years. So if you did a really bad job of getting that customer implemented really quickly and helping them see value, and they dropped your service before 3 to 4 years, you never recoup your costs on that customer. So that shared risk model was something I felt really, really good about as, someone, again, like, why am I doing this with software? Why have I been so? Because I really can see the value that these tools can provide to customers. And if you have a shared risk model, you can, as a provider, create that kind of long-term relationship that every SaaS company wants to create. We're at a line of demarcation where I've seen a lot of those relationships go sour. And there are two reasons why I see them going sour: communication and trust, which is the basis of any relationship. So I think this is a great opportunity for us to have a reset. Where am I seeing things falling down? One is in extractive patterns. I gave the example of, AI innovation in your product, you're incurring additional costs and just blindly assuming by handing the customer a renewal for 6x that they're happy to shoulder, frankly, the burden and the risk of seeing value from something that's untested at this point in time. We are in pilot stage for a lot of these offerings, not all, but for a lot of these offerings, you likely as a provider don't have a lot of customers using it today that are happy to talk about it, that are actually saying, this is the amount of ROI I've gotten from using these tools. You have early adopters, I hope. That's great. Yeah. You're learning, but let's be serious. We're not in a stage now where you can hand someone a 6x renewal and assume that that's just going to work. And that's that's sort of what I'm seeing in the industry today. I'm also seeing situations where people are moving really fast, as they should. Competitive moat's very important, but they're not bringing their customers along with them. And so kind of stepping back, making sure that you're communicating, not with every customer, but at least with your brain trust of customers, so that you are co-creating these innovations together. You're making sure that there's a really short feedback loop between the customer, the people who are talking to the customer, and product. We've moved away from that. I've seen a lot of modern SaaS companies, they look more like the big enterprise companies of yesteryear. And I'm going to blame the financial community for that for a bit. I've gotten really impatient for growth, and that we've seen some extractive practices because of that. And it's disappointing in part because, the clear-eyed analyst that I was years ago, maybe naive to believe that we finally cracked the code on how to create more of a shared value and less of an extractive approach. But we seem to be there again with a lot of these approaches. There's a book from a couple of years ago, the enshittification of a lot of different industries. And I think enshittification actually became an Oxford Dictionary word as a result of this. But it talks
I need a shirt for that. That's actually such a good.
You're using that in our next call. I want that in our next call. I just want you to throw that word out.
I will. I promise on my next customer call, I'm going to be like, this is just enshittification.
Yeah, and that term is jump the shark. I mean, I was talking to a neighbor at a Super Bowl party. She said, have you heard about this thing, enshittification? Like, oh my gosh, yes. I can't believe that someone not in this space knows what that is. But, we've all experienced it. Ad models, right? Intrusive ad models where we didn't expect them to be. I could go on and on. Some of the things in my personal life, Prime Video is one where lately you're watching some show and it's at this pivotal moment, and then suddenly an ad pops up that's totally different energy than where you were when you what? I'm already paying for this. Where did these ads come from? And of course, there's a button you can click to pay to go ad free, but it didn't start off like that. Things tend to move in a model of being more and more extractive. And so I am really hopeful, again, drawing on that sort of doe-eyed early analyst person, that this inflection point and this shift in the conversation to more usage and outcome-based models, which then they do tend to reset that risk a little bit more, and that the shoulder of that burden is a bit more on the provider with those models, that will help us get the reset that I think we need to be more customer centric.
Okay, Amy, you are, so you have guests on and you're like, okay, you know, you've studied this, and then you have guests on that have studied it and experienced it. And you always know the difference between those type of guests. And so you're definitely one that you've done everything and you experienced everything, which I love. Looking at it, you'd be like, Amy, how has she been alive long enough to do that? You see me, you'd be like, of course, Casey's done all those things. He's bald, he's old, of course. Amy, I have a question for you, because this is SaaS Therapy, and I usually get the most therapy for myself. So here's a question I have for you.
True. We're the patients, if you didn't guess.
Yeah. So here's the question for you, Amy. Okay, let's say that I'm a SaaS software and I bill on monthly active users. Okay, so unique monthly active users. So every month I'm going to bill you according to unique users. So just for that month, right? The person buying says, okay, that's great. I love it because we're sharing risk here. I'm not overpaying for licenses, but then I'm only going to pay for the licenses that get used. But obviously there's someone on their side in procurement that's saying, wait, what happens if we get a lot of usage? Then we're going to have to pay for this. And so how do I balance my budget to actually know that we're going to pay for this? Because right now you requested budget for, let's say, $30,000. But if this really went really well, we could be spending $80,000. How do I appropriately look at that risk? So if you are a SaaS organization and you're trying to do this shared burden, you're trying to do it off of usage and outcomes, how do you help everybody feel comfortable that there is a possible side where you might pay more because you're getting more, and make that all balanced out in a cost structure? Like, this is what you do every day. Give some people some best practices, because what we're hoping for is people are going to contact you after this and say, Amy, I need your services. Please help us. So just pretend that we're just having a normal conversation, and you're just going to give me some points to think about. You don't have to give away your secret sauce, but give me some points to think about as I'm trying to help my sellers sell this to their buyers. How do they balance that?
Yeah. So I will say it's very simple, and you already know the answer. And I will also say there is no secret sauce when it comes to pricing. Honestly, like these models, there are only a few of them. It's like plots in a book, right? I think there's like 7 actual plots. There are enormous number of books. I always have 3 books at least on my bedside table. It doesn't matter to me that there are only a certain number of plots, because the way about talking about the plots is what is different. And so I think the art is actually in the communication of the model, not in the model of itself. But let's take your specific example that you gave. And because we were touching on maybe our collective experience, I think you may remember this example. Back in the very early days when we all started to get mobile phones, there was something new called SMS messaging. So this idea that you could text. Now, very early on, you didn't have like a keypad, unless you had a BlackBerry. You were using the numbers. It was very cumbersome.
D9, 10 cents a message, right?
Exactly. So you paid for every message that you used. Now, at that time, people weren't texting. I don't even know if texting was a verb or if it was called that. It was annoying. It was something that you did as a last, you would normally call people, but it like last ditch. And the way that you would pay for your cell phone bill at the time was you'd have a minutes plan, and that was typically tiered, and you would pay per message. And that may have been tiered as well. Now, over time, as adoption of that technology, let's call it SMS, became more prevalent today, I don't think any of us on the phone here or on the podcast here actually pay per SMS. It's rolled into the cost of our plan. So what does that example have anything to do with what you laid out, Casey, as far as that example? There are 2 techniques, maybe 3, in pricing that cell phone example covers. Number 1 is tiering. Why is tiering important? Because tiering helps buffer some of the unpredictability and risk of users and usage. So what that SaaS company should do is have some level of tiers. I wouldn't advise any more than 3 to 5, because simplicity is also a fundamental plot of pricing and packaging. And the more complex you get, the diminishing returns that you end up having, because the customer thinks you must be hiding something. It's like the Cheesecake Factory menu. It becomes so overwhelming that you're like, I can't decide. I'm going to go somewhere where it's a little bit simpler for me to choose what I want. So you would have some sort of a tiering model, and then you would have some sort of a usage element for bursting capacity, let's say. So if you have some sort of, in general, we've got 30 active users, but in some months we might have consultants helping us close our books. And so we've got 5 additional users. So in those months, you maybe pay some bursting capacity for those 5 additional users. What happens if you bring those 5 additional users on your team and that bursting capacity starts to become important? Because it's flexible, and flexibility you pay more for. That's another core plot theme of pricing. Everyone agrees with it. Like that guest pass that you might have or whatever it is, that's always going to cost you a little bit more than if you were just like rolling it into your base plan. And so what happens if you're using a little bit more bursting capacity you didn't expect? That's an opportunity in the relationship to have a conversation with the customer and say, I noticed that bursting of 5 users, it seems like they're part of your team now. And now it kind of kicks you into that next tier, making a lot more sense for you. Let's have a conversation about whether that's the right place for you to be from a predictability perspective. It's going to cost you more than that base tier, but it's not going to cost you more than the base tier plus the 5 additional users that you're paying for every month. So that's the way that you handle those scenarios. Again, it's like a tale as old as time. It's certainly, that model is even older than the cell phone model. But I will say, if there are listeners here that are looking for pricing and packaging expertise, you can look me up. There are a lot of other resources on pricing and packaging, whole groups of people that look at SaaS pricing and packaging, because it is not a set it and forget it exercise. And I think it is something that it's better to have like a support group around you of, have you tried this, or when you do this? But the more you look at this area, I think the more you will find there is a code, is not very complex, even though it can absolutely seem complex. But when you start getting to the point where you have 8 million iterations and your product catalog that's when you are at a point where, like, look, let's get down to brass tacks, because it can become a diminishing returns. Pricing is one of those things. I think one of the reasons I like it so much is if you try to go too far down the science path, it's you really got to pull back and realize, like, this isn't, you can't, the perfect pricing model is not the right one if the customer can't understand it. If it's not simple enough that they can, like, in their mind be like, oh, I can see what I might be paying for this. I can see how it's predictable and it seems fair to me. So that's where that conversation and having a field that's enabled to have that conversation is so, so important. I don't think that's the part that a lot of teams are thinking about today. They're doing the science part, which is, what's the perfect model? Our costs are going to be this. And they're over indexing around the science part, and they're forgetting that someone needs to have a conversation with the customer about this, and the customer has to think it's reasonable and fair. And that should not be an afterthought. That should be part of the development of these things.
I got to ask one more question, Todd. I got to have a follow up on this. This is so good. So, Amy, Todd and I, we kind of, how you're always like, oh, I'd love to be a fly on the wall in these type of conversations. Me and Todd get to be the fly on the wall in a lot of SaaS renewals and different conversations like that with different SaaS organizations. So, one of the things I want to get your opinion on this. One more. We'll be sitting in meetings, and again, we have no stake in the game or anything like that. We're just sitting there, right? So we're like commentaries. We're just watching. And the customer will be like, hey, we only used 800 out of the 2,000 licenses. And the sales rep will be going, but look at the outcomes that you had out of those 800 licenses. So our goal is we just need to get those other 1,200 doing the same thing so we can get to these outcomes. That's why you're going to pay what you're paying. And there seems to be this battle between usage and outcomes. Is that just healthy friction and that's what it's always going to be? Or is there anything else that people should be discussing in that? Is there anything else that you might add as a comment around that? So this side's feeling like I'm not getting as many people using it, and this side's saying, but let's recognize the outcomes on the people that are using it. Our issue is just we got to get more people using it. So I need your help, customer, to go get more people using this. Is that just healthy friction? It's always going to exist?
I think it will. So first of all, outcomes are always going to be the number one area of pushback, because, and I said this from the very beginning, they're not just because you can demonstrate back. It depends on what the outcome is. But let's say, the outcome is an efficiency number or something that you think you can measure in the system. The customer is always going to say, yeah, your tool helped us, but you know what? We also trained our people and we did this thing and that made us more efficient. So outcomes is one of those things that it is always going to be a conversation, and you will always want to drive the customer to positive outcomes. But if you're talking to a procurement person, they're always going to poo-poo outcomes. So I would make sure and by the way, I hadn't said this yet, but I do want to sort of implied, when I talk to companies about their pricing approaches, having a breadth and a depth measurement is always a good thing. So if you have a user measurement plus a usage measurement, or a user plus an outcome, that's a good thing, in part because the number of users is one thing, but actually what those users are able to achieve with the tool, if you're able to measure that, that's very important. But that second measurement is usually a smaller portion of the overall spend. For necessary reasons, it's a little bit less predictable for customers. And because of that, it's always going to be, unless it's pure usage and in system usage, it's always going to be something that's going to provoke a conversation. But you as a provider should always be looking at that platform fee, whether it's a user or usage. And that's where you're focusing your customer success. That's where you're focusing your enablement, because that is the scarier number to look at than the outcome, because it's harder to defend the outcome with the customers in a pricing conversation. Not only that, going back to my comment about your ability to communicate this model to customers up front is so important. Sellers are pretty good, I would expect today, at creating the expectation with the customers. If they're paying for the users or the usage, they're not as good at having those value conversations about the outcome. Because to the customer, that's the same thing as saying, I'm going to solve your problem. Great. And this is my pricing fee, and this is how it's going to be. Like, they're not thinking today that the outcome is what they're explicitly paying for. We're going to have to shift our customer conversations around that if, in fact, we are going to be in a position or want to be in a position to go back to the customers and say, we want more money because we're helping you achieve the outcome, even though you're underutilized from a user perspective. So it is very hard to have that conversation retroactively. Much better to have that up front and set that expectation up front so that you're not backpedaling with a customer who hasn't caught up to you quite yet of where the actual what they're paying for. Being able to show the outcome, by the way, regardless of whether you're monetizing that, is super important from a retention perspective. But when it comes to expansion, it's a bit harder to defend if you don't have a predictable usage that's increasing.
Oh, Amy, I mean, I just want to say preach. Like, I love that so much. The thing that I struggle with a lot when I look at different SaaS companies, and I'm not a pricing expert, I'm just a Joe Schmo who gets frustrated whenever he feels like the way a SaaS product is being presented doesn't compute in my brain, like if I were a buyer. And so the most common thing that I get frustrated by is seeing the fact that I can get behind a per user pricing model as an example, but oftentimes just imagine, like we used a security example earlier. Well, like if I'm in IT, I think my users are dummies. So if you sell me a security solution that's going to help them, but I know they're never going to really touch it and I don't necessarily care. But for me, I'm going to be able to sleep well at night. Well, if I'm pricing every single user at $100 per user, well, I think they're dumb and they're not going to use this thing. This is actually a thing that the value is for me in IT. So shouldn't I be pricing it and put the burden of the price on the IT user rather than on the end users and the security organization or who are going to be impacted by this, right? And so for me, I always wonder about like, how do you understand where to price the value? Right? Do you do a low like there might be lots of users, but maybe most of those users are free, but we're going to put the price on the user who cares. But now that's a really big price for a few licenses of the software versus, or do I just do a platform fee and then I don't really care about the users? And so obviously there's a lot of different ways to slice that cake. But from your perspective, how do you go through that exercise to understand who cares about paying for it? Because if I distribute it, and it's all about positioning, right? I could be charging you the same price, but if I charge you too much on the user who doesn't care or doesn't really matter versus the person who does care, how do you balance that, and how do you go through that exercise to determine who cares about the price, and how do you position it in the right way? I don't know if that made sense.
No, it makes a lot of sense. And I'm going to harken back a little bit to my analyst days with this. So there were, and I think there still are, three major categories of software. The first is application software, and think of that as end user software, business software that you or I as a business user would care about. It's on my machine, it's CRM, it's my accounting software, it's my MarTech, that is end user applications or end user software that business users would care about. And so we've largely been talking about in this conversation that category of software, in part because I use those as examples because most people have experience with that. The other category of software, another category of software is developer tools software. And these are tools that would be used by developers. And then you also have infrastructure software. And I think of that as software that's machine to machine. The actual consumer of that software is a machine. I know I have tons of machine software on my device that I use for work. My IT organization puts it on. I don't care about it. Actually, sometimes I might find it more intrusive than not, but I know it's part of being in an organization. It keeps me secure. It keeps my files secure. It keeps the integrity of the software that I'm running. I don't as a user care about it. And from an IT perspective, though, the way that they would think about paying for it would be based on the number of machines. In that case, the machine is a proxy for value versus Amy. I'm not doing this for Amy. I'm doing this for the machine or the tool that Amy happens to use. And there's some number of machines or tools that exist in the organization. And as a measurement of breadth, or as a proxy similar to the per seat model, I would be paying per machine for antivirus software to keep everybody's software secure. Then I might also have some sort of a console or administrative console for the people within the IT organizations who are administering, running, monitoring, doing the diagnostics on that tool as well. So depending on which of those three categories your software sits in, I think a lot of the SaaS industry, frankly, in the very early days, the biggest value proposition was in fact around things like antivirus software. Why is that? Well, one of the big revolutionary things about the SaaS industry was that the software was always up to date. And think about what type of software do you need to have most up to date? Well, it's the antivirus software, because your software is only secure. In fact, I, during this conversation, had a pop-up for something that I had to accept, some sort of patch or something like that would come down. So it was a huge value proposition, because in the old world, they'd like mail a CD out to you and you had to put the latest version of Norton antivirus or whatever it was on your home computer. Now you don't have to think about that anymore. So that was hugely valuable. So those infrastructure tools that secure machines, those are actually one of the first categories of SaaS to become widely adopted. Some of the things that were farther out were like super heavy network things, or, even like DoD, highly proprietary information. A lot of that still is not in the cloud. But long answer for your question, and I'm going into different areas. But the point is that if you're in an infrastructure category or a tool category, the way that you price your software still might have a breadth and a depth measurement to it, but it's going to be different than business software, is my point.
I think that was amazing. Way better than I could have thought as an answer.
Right.
So
Time flew by. We always end every episode with the same question because we named this SaaS Therapy. We wanted to have a safe place where people go, oh, that is my situation. That is what I'm dealing with. Oh, that helps so much. So we always like the therapist, which is our guest, to assign homework to our patients. So Amy, if you could give one homework assignment to our audience today, what would be the homework assignment you'd give them?
Go outside and take a walk. That's my homework assignment. I don't think, there's so much happening, and I don't know, listen to the birds. And I don't get to smell the flowers where I am in Boston because they are not out, but just being out in nature feels really important to do right now.
That's so good. And, for me, I would add to that, make sure maybe you leave your cell phone at home while you do it. Because for me, one of the things that I love about that advice, and I personally have struggled this, is like there's so much going on. Disconnection from the machine of technology can sometimes help you be better when you return back.
Yeah.
And so making sure that you give your brain time to reset and to think and to focus and to think deeply. I love that. It's really good advice.
Yeah. And I think reminding what makes us human is like, that is the value, even when it comes to topics like pricing and packaging, maybe especially when it comes to topics like pricing and packaging. And so that, I think, is a good reminder. I tend to wear my earbuds and listen to podcasts when I take a walk. So thank you for that suggestion. I really should really just be present in the moment. And I'll take some of your therapy advice too.
I love it, Amy. All right. So obviously you need to go find Amy on LinkedIn and follow her. The Subscribed Institute from Zora is a good place to go check her out as well. Amy, thanks so much for joining us. Any last thoughts as far as people want to connect with you? Any other ways for them to find you?
No, I think that's the best place for now. I love talking about all of this. And I love seeing what's happening and what's going to happen next. So I hope you all reach out.
Awesome. Thanks, Amy. And thanks, everybody, for joining us today. And if you haven't already, subscribe, come back and listen. We do these every week. We release a new episode every Wednesday. So thanks, everybody. SaaS Therapy is brought to you by Brainstorm, the SaaS platform for SaaS adoption. Learn more at brainstorminc.com.